we're in a bubbling national discourse about squatters' rights right now, right?
Yeah.
And the notion that this is in some way a real hindrance to landlords and their ability to do what they want to do with their tenants. And but as your piece really lays bare, there are a lot of protections in place for landlords legally, and very little protections in place for people who may not be able to afford their rent for a little while. I mean, what were some of the cases that you saw where people were pushed out of their homes because of circumstances maybe that they even couldn't control?
Um, well, I mean, certainly in the context of rent increases, that's out of the control of tenants. And, in sort of an economic environment, particularly in Columbus, where you're not seeing significant wage increases, people end up just in a vicious cycle of not being able to, afford where they're living. And I mean, rent increases anywhere from, I mean, I've seen 30% rent increases for tenants. When I spoke and communicated with them about their struggles. And so there's really no way for someone who's working a low wage job to keep up with that level of rent increase.
Right. And so when, say, your rent gets increased 30%, you don't have anywhere to go and you are evicted, but you're staying longer as you figure out your next move. That would be an example of why squatters' rights would be important, or tenants' rights versus the right of a landlord to evict whenever they choose.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge of the moment is landlord tenant law is a very local matter. It varies state by state. It can even vary city by city. And so a lot of the push on that I saw in talking to a lot of tenants' rights groups and national groups that are studying this problem is that there's really no way out of this bind unless there's some federal regulation on what's going on for within landlord tenant law.
Right.
That's a challenging, complicated, uh, uh, yeah. I mean, how that unfolds. I mean, there's been some various attempts. There's been some really interesting proposals, but I think we're very early days on how to sort of address this gap between sort of the legal context at the local level and the limits of federal intervention into the housing crisis that, I saw, if it's even happening in Columbus, Ohio, where, pretty much rents were mostly affordable in my lifetime and have just in the last 10 years become just punitive to the point of impossible for most people. It, yeah, the question of kind of how to solve that is, I think, remains, an open question.
Certainly. I mean, we're getting a little bit of a trickle out from the Biden administration that they see housing as a problem. I'd said a few months ago Biden should run on a national housing initiative, but we haven't federally funded affordable housing
Yeah.
since the 90s because of the Faircloth Amendment and like these neoliberal practices. We should have some sort of standardized national rent control in addition to building more housing and zoning practices so there can be duplexes and really though I just can't imagine how in any just society a 30% rental increase should be allowed. I mean that should be federally regulated as an undue burden on the tenant, but we don't have tenants protections nationally in this country whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, the push for a tenant bill of rights was kind of, was the blueprint in January of 2023. Yeah, so we're a year later now. What that's sort of been diluted down to is a possible cap of 10% on rent increases for housing that's in that receives low-income housing tax credits in the U.S. So that's an interesting proposal, but it would only impact about 2.5 million households. And when you think about there's 44 million rental households, is that enough? And additionally, you know, the people I interviewed at Eviction Court, the people I spend time with in other reporting that I'm doing, a 10% increase is still impossible economically for most people.
Right.
I mean, 30% is out there, but even capping at 10% is, I mean, I mean, inflation rates of 4 and 5% put people under. At 10% for one of your biggest monthly expenses is impossible for a lot of people, and can lead to them being displaced and without housing. So,
And as we wrap up here, Maya, what in your observations, what was the kind of or what were the kind of people who were landlords, right? And who were the kind of people who were tenants? Are you seeing this kind of rapid increase in corporately owned housing in Columbus? I mean, you speak about this automated landlord system, but for the kind of more existing structure in Columbus, who are the landlords, and then who are the tenants, really?
I mean, Columbus has seen a mass infusion of investment from out of state and a lot of consolidation into. It's not just that you have landlords who are, Wall Street owners, but you have property management systems that operate for smaller landlords. So even this idea of a mom and pop landlord, maybe someone who in the past had 10 to 12 properties that they managed personally, they're now turning that over to these property management, either companies or software programs that really takes a lot of the human discretion out of that relationship. So you're seeing that I think on a pretty rapid, it's almost a complete change in how that relationship works. And so I've seen that here, where it just, people have kind of given up and just turned over the management of that to other companies. So that's a significant change in how tenants sort of interacted with their landlords. I would say for tenants, I think the frustrating thing that I've seen from them is they just can't negotiate with anybody. It's very difficult to begin a conversation about, I'm having an issue, I had my car break down, I can't make my rent this month, and just a little lack of accommodation or grace within the system because of the way that these metrics that are now being applied through property management software to making decisions about ensuring the landlord's not just profitability, but perhaps excessive profitability in their portfolios. So that's a
Yes.
vast change. Yeah.
My building in COVID, and I moved into this building. I'm in here in Brooklyn, probably around 6 months after one of these corporate conglomerates purchased it. And the tenants that were there before speak of an entirely different situation until after this management company purchased it. And I will say that the only way I got my air conditioning repaired last summer, in the middle of the summer, in August, after it breaking down for 2 months, was I had to file a complaint with the city, and they came and inspected it and issued a violation, and that was the only way that it got fixed. So it had also leaked into the floorboards and warped, and mold was starting. So it was a total nightmare. And it's one of the, I mean, this is universal, I gotta say. Like, this is exactly something I had experienced too. And at least the unit is rent controlled. That's part of why they are so hesitant to improve it, because they can't gouge people. But you're even showing that in places where there's no rent control and they go up 30%, there are still those conditions that are created because there's this kind of impunity right now for landlords, especially when they're big corporations and it becomes so standardized.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, even adding to that, there's a lot of informal displacement of tenants, especially within low-income housing that is available. I mean, in Columbus, we had 2 mass displacements of people within a 2-year period. I mean, you're talking not a few, 30, 40 people, like hundreds of families in a single day displaced. So there's nowhere for them to go.
Right.
It's just getting harder for people to, find a viable situation to just live their daily lives. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time today, and the piece is really good in Harper's. It's called The Evictions Experts, and we will link to it wherever you're listening to or watching this. Mya Frazier, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.